Welcome to Unspoken. I'm Catherine Sims, Clinical Director at ITTC and LPC, and I'm speaking with Clara Sainte, an LCSW and a grief recovery specialist.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Well, first off, I really am just curious to kind of know what your path is that led you to the work that you're doing. I have noted in my notes here, let me just get to it, that on your LinkedIn page, you've been listed as a grief specialist going all the way back to 2010.
So I grew up in a small rural town in Missouri, and so very Midwest born, and just had lots of childhood experiences that really lent me to the ideas of social work, right? And just justice and advocacy. A lot of my queer and LGBTQ advocacy started as a young child. I learned around age 7 that my gay uncles weren't allowed to be married, which was very confusing as a child because they seemed as married as my parents. So some of that kind of early discrimination and rights not being equal to all people kind of really began there. But I ended up meeting a few very pivotal people, mentors along the way that kind of geared me into social work and into moving to Kansas City, the big city, as we call it, which is pretty funny for people who live in bigger metros. But I came here for graduate school in 2008 and very quickly actually met a fellow social work student who would later become my partner. And we've now been married several years, and he presents as well. And he's Haitian American. And so our work in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, having biracial children, and just really the intersectionalities of all our privileges or not so privileged areas, and how it plays out in our clients' lives, and really didn't show up in our education in a real way and as intentional as it is, I think, now, being that I actually teach this for the University of Kansas as well. So that's kind of how I got into all the DEI stuff. I got into grief work, quite honestly. My father died suddenly in an accident when I was 12. And we had lots of sudden deaths in my family, actually, all throughout my childhood. So I was doing this work long before I knew I could get paid for it or I had to have letters behind my name. This was just always something I was comfortable doing. And through mentorship, through, education, et cetera, I found the right footing in the right place. As a mentor would call, I found my calling. I asked that she rephrased that. That sounded pretty religious, and I was raised Catholic, and I was like, can we rename that? Like, I'm just really good at it, or I feel really comfortable at it. But I would agree. It's definitely my calling.
Yeah. If you had to pick another word for that, like what would that be? Would it be like the thing you're most passionate about?
Yeah, I would say meaning. I
Meaning.
find the most meaning in this work.
Yeah.
Um, it it wasn't something I read in a book or I, was really taught, but there's been my life course has led me to find meaning in the work.
Yeah, yeah. I was reflecting when I was looking through some of your background and whatnot. I was reflecting on my own education, like formal education around grief work.
Mhm.
And I don't,
Yeah.
I don't really recall that being a huge topic of conversation, even in terms of like diagnostic differences and being able to recognize where
Yeah.
overlaps are and what would constitute X diagnosis versus another while somebody's
Yeah.
process.
Exactly. And redirect me at any point when I start going too much on a tangent, because that's how I speak, neurodivergent at its finest. So I think that for me, that was my biggest complaint of my program. My program was really specific to child welfare folks who were coming, like, who had been in the field for a while and had their BSWs and now needed to come back to get that master's. And I was the only one of my program at the time that had any interest in learning end of life or grief. And so I actually did independent studies because I was like, y'all can't teach me. Let's figure this out. And so I think, when I got hired at the University of Kansas a couple years ago, that was a big thing for me was, asking my students day one, what are you going to go into in social work? And most of them, not all, but most of them were like, well, I was going to take the trauma class, but it's at the same time and it was full. So I ended up in your class and like, I don't know why I'm here. I'm not going to work with grieving people. And I'm like, cute. Okay. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
And you would name all the other areas, that we think of in schools and incarceration and unhoused folks and LGBTQ communities and BIPOC communities. It doesn't matter, right? And I'm like, grief, loss, loss, loss. What are you doing? And so
Yeah.
we still have, even in our field, a misconception of when we use grief. And it does not always mean end of life. Although I have worked in hospice and there is still that very specific, and I'm cancer care part of my practice. But for a majority of the time, it's just our change in expectations. We grieve little griefs all day.
Yeah. I think that's so beautiful and well said. That's definitely something that when I'm doing trauma work, because you can't, as you sort of are acknowledging, you can't escape the grief component of it. And it's the expectation piece. It's the loss of innocence. It's the sadness around memories that could have been made or that would have been made had X things not quite happened. And it's the loss of like experience that people have an expectation to be able to have in their lives at some point in time. And I do think that that's like an under recognized component of grief, and also an under recognized component of what contributes to the longevity of it, the
Yeah.
changes in expectations at different points in your life that bring up so-called like previously resolved. I don't know if I really like that kind of language around it. But
We re-grieve with
yeah,
each new loss for sure. And that gets very confusing for clients, to be honest, because they're like, I thought I dealt with this.
yeah,
This is a death or a loss, from years ago. Like, I don't understand why I'm having so many emotions now. And it's like, okay, well, let's talk about the activations that's happening right now. Like, I'm working with a widower whose children are quite young. And he knows my background. And so he's like, what does it look like? My grief is 26 years old of my dad. And we talk about that, like my wedding, my, children. There's like the monumental changes and things we achieve that we think of, like, oh, obviously you were sad your dad wasn't there. But it's in the like really small nuance of, like getting a golf lesson. He was a golf pro, and he would teach me how to better my chipping game. I still have taken several lessons, and that's still the shittiest part of my game. So that's the thing, right? Like, of those like little things are often what hang up people more than like a death anniversary or a big scan or like something that we expect grief to show up. The anticipation of those dates often is harder than the date itself, but it's all that littler stuff that we just don't voice.
yeah, yeah. That anticipatory like anxiety that goes around some of those moments. It is, you're absolutely right. I think that in my experience as well, that expectation can almost soften it sometimes because you know it's coming. It's those ones that hit you out of nowhere. That was sort of really, oh, they just take you out, like kick the feet out from underneath you.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that's what I see most in my practice and in my role is education around what to really expect. I know that's one of your questions, so sorry if I'm jumping ahead, but that's how my brain works. This is a common misconception
Yeah.
of, oh, well, of course I'm sad. It's X date, right? Our father died 2 weeks before his birthday, which is 2 weeks before Father's Day. So we have kind of a trifecta month of these big dates. And I'll swear to you, my sister already knows this, so it won't be surprised to her when she listens to the podcast. But I get kind of mad at her about every late May. Our birthdays have happened. We have our birthdays are 3 days apart. We always celebrate. But I start to get kind of irritated. She kind of starts bothering me because a lot of my grief is she was 7 years older. So she got a whole lot more dad and the
Mhm.
high school memories. He took her to college. I was in seventh grade when he passed away. And so she got all this time. And it took a long time in therapy for me to kind of work through that. But I start to kind of just find her irritating. And the only way I ever notice is I will complain to our mother. And my mom will just be like, Clara, yeah, it's May. And I'll be like, oh, I'm not mad at her. I'm
Yeah.
grieving. I actually love my sister. I find her a normal dose of irritating. It's not like, and so there's that like cue. But it's 26 years later and I still forget. I need my mother to remind me, and I do this for a living. We don't
Yeah.
see.
Yeah.
We're in it.
We're in it. Yeah, you're in it. We've done some international work around post-traumatic growth and had the opportunity to go to Rwanda at one point. And one of the gentlemen that we interviewed there made a comment. The genocide was in April, and they have 100 days of mourning. But one of the gentlemen that we interviewed made a comment about how in April kids are he in his conversations, kids
Mhm.
start to wonder why their parents are acting a little off, why their parents are a little bit more irritable. And even though it happens every single year, those parents, they're in it.
Yeah.
Uh, and it doesn't matter that there's a sense of predictability to it,
Mhm.
because that's not the piece that you're holding on to. What you're holding on to is all the emotional stuff that goes with it.
Oh yeah, it's, the body keeps the score, right? We know that it's, in the DNA of
Yeah.
everyone and passed down. And it's just kind of it's a terrible word, but it's like the vibe. Like everybody is just feeling it.
Yeah.
That's not how I want to use the word vibe, but here we are. And so that idea of that intensity is
Mhm.
just living with you. And it takes sometimes an outsider, or at least someone, outside our own brain's experience to be like, I wonder if it's this.
Yeah. I wonder if this is what's happening for you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Uh,
this happens for most folks.
what's that?
Oh, sorry. It happens for most folks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just want you to know I appreciate you bouncing around too. I can totally hang with that. I'm here for it. One of the things that I was interested to when I was looking through some of your work is I guess in my head, and this may just be because I don't do a lot of work with children or teenagers. In my head, I had envisioned you working with adults going through grief, but from the looks of your work, it looks like you're doing this work across the lifespan. Um,
Mhm.
and a lot of work with children, in fact, on how to grieve. And hearing your background, that makes a lot of sense that you would have a lens through that. Is that primarily the work that you're doing? Are you doing family systems kind of work?
So when I ran a cancer organization for about 8.5 years, and that was the whole family system. And so I still do a lot of education around that. I still do a lot of help with parents who are living with cancer that are in my office. So I have done kid stuff. I have worked both in grief and in, kind of cancer specific loss with kiddos and teens over the years. Most notably, I had a dad stop by the office one day, just unexpectedly dropped in and was like, my wife died a year ago from cancer, but my 15-year-old refuses to see a counselor because they won't understand her unless they have a dead parent. So I don't even know what to do. And without even a filter, I laughed a little bit. I kind of chuckled and I was like, well, unfortunately for her, I guess you get to go to home and tell her that you found somebody. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, my dad did not die from cancer, but I don't have both of my parents. And so she came in just begrudgingly. I mean, she did not want to be in therapy. And this is always my favorite question of a teen. I'm like, okay, 0 to 10, 0, they dragged your ass here, and 10, you skipped in so excited for therapy. Where are we at right now?
Yeah.
And she was like a 0, and I was like, cool, this is the deal. It's your therapy. I'm here regardless. I'm paid regardless. If you don't want to talk to me at all, that's fine. But like, sucks for you. You found somebody with a dead parent. She's like, I know, right? So just kind of that was the rapport building. Angry little teens are my favorite, actually. And I saw her for a couple of years, and then she went away to college and actually has returned to my practice as a young adult. And so it's fascinating because I have now seen her about 9 years of her life of like, you're an adult now. Like, I remember teen you would have really dealt with this differently. So it's nice to sometimes have those like long connections. But I generally now in practice try my hardest to work with one energy at a time and one adult energy at a time. So I don't love couples work, even though I could, and I don't love family work, even though I could.
Yeah.
So it's more that I just would rather navigate one person at a time. I've done my share of groups over the years, and happy to set that down now.
Yeah. I think that's the beauty of having some longevity in this field is you get
Yeah.
really comfortable being like, I think I'm
Yeah.
good. I think we're okay to shift over here now.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean I won't pick it up again. When they're good, they're so good. There's so much power in a group dynamic and in a
Yeah.
group session. And when they're not, they're just exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah. They take an extra amount of
Yeah.
energy.
I have
Absolutely.
to work too hard for it.
Absolutely. On your website, you have the term keep showing up. Um,
Mhm.
and while I think I have kind of an understanding and I can understand how that would resonate with me as a client and both as a clinician, can you expand on why that was important for you to put on your website?
Yeah, it's really like my ethos to be true. We don't have to know how. You don't have to know what you're doing. You don't have to know how to take the next step, but you got to keep showing up. And it is not uncommon that we let what we don't know stop us from doing what we need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I have some anxiety if something's outside my comfort zone. I know myself well enough to know that I will turn something down. I will say no, but I know not to give any answers until I've given myself 24 hours to really think about it. Because my gut reaction, you get to the edges of the comfort zone, it's always going to be a no. That's new. I'm going to suck at that. I'm not going to do that. That's too much. It's too hard.
Yeah.
And then if I give myself a day, I'm like, I could probably do that. That's fine. Um, but I think the keep showing up often in grief work and in cancer work, I spend more time in the therapy or in the group sessions unpacking the ways people didn't show up and their support that they expected to get during those times as what they're processing more than the death or the cancer itself. And I work with a lot of caregivers. I work with a lot of, hey, this person in my family and friends are dealing with this. So I do a lot of supporting the person maybe outside that specific center client, in how to talk, how to communicate. That's one of the biggest things I present on is how to communicate in these difficult situations and in the healthcare setting, specifically around grief and cancer, because we do a bad job.
Yeah.
And not intentionally. Most people are not intentionally trying to be mean, but man, do we miss the boat and being able to show up well.
Yeah. I think this is probably one of those other areas around like the expectation
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
where it's
Oh, yeah.
just kind of, I was going to say damaged, but that feels like too less of impactful, like blown out of the water kind of.
Yeah, yeah, missed for sure. And
Yeah.
I think, I use the term supportive third from an educational standpoint. This kind of helps people understand, in our support systems, like if you and I today kind of thought about our circles of people and who we have in our lives and we were diagnosed tomorrow, there's this small percentage, it's like 5 to 10%. This is research backed by Alan Wolfeld's work, but small percentage that like ghost. They don't know what to say or do. They're uncomfortable. They have their own stuff going on in their lives. They might be the mean people who say rude things, but they really go away mostly. There's a huge percentage, about 85% of people who mean well and say things like, you got this. You're so strong. You're so brave. Like, let me know if you need anything. And then they kind of just rely on that center person, on that client, that patient to figure it out, and then have the emotional labor to ask and then have to deal with you maybe not doing it and letting them down again. So it's complicated there. But then there's like the 5% that really show up. They're the supportive third. Like they don't ask how they do. They like see the lawn needed mowed and they just mow it. They're like, I'm going to get your kids. Does Thursday or Friday work better? Done. They're more directive. They can hold space better. That's what I think of is the grief people have. You're right, in terms of people not fitting into the spot they wanted. So this is something I map out with clients. Like some of your grief is that you keep asking Catherine to be in the supportive third, and she has proven again and again she can't do it. And what people have to really reframe is that a lot of times it's not because the person means to not show up well. It's because they don't have the capacity or they just don't know how. And so there is some labor required to like help them learn how to best show up. So a good example, like I really need my house cleaned. Some people get very uncomfortable at the idea of asking a friend to come clean their house, even though that would be the most helpful task, but it feels a little invasive. It just feels like, I don't want you to judge me. That feels like such an insane thing to ask of another friend. Like, ugh, I don't like it. Okay, but could you ask said friend to get you a house cleaner? Be like, what I really need is a house cleaner. Could you figure that out? The logistics, the company, the reviews, the payment, handle it.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be so helpful. So there's ways to really work with clients of like, what's the barrier? So many people are like, well, I don't want to burden others, but I would do it for a friend,
Yeah.
but I don't want to ask them to do it for me. And so really unpacking our kind of understanding around help, around asking, and then like the people have to do it. They have to actually show up. And then you are like, well, if I got, let down before, I'm not going to ask again, and getting over those hurdles.
Sure. Yeah, it makes you a little shy to ask again because those feelings are all involved and yeah,
Yeah.
reasons. Yeah. We spend a lot of time talking about intent versus impact.
Yeah. Sure.
This is a little bit of what you're speaking to that you can have all the positive intentions in the world, but however that manifests for you, the impact can look a lot different on whoever is on the receiving end of that.
Yeah. And that gets us a lot into the DEI space of diversity, equity, inclusion, because, most people are like, well, I meant well.
Right.
I was trying to help.
Right.
I thought I was doing the right thing. And I'm like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have a very solution focused sort of approach here in terms of these are the things that you really genuinely need, and here's the way to communicate these things and the barriers that are impeding you from being able to ask in a
Mhm.
way that feels articulate and that somebody will respond to.
Sure. I think solution focused, yes. I work with a lot of neurodivergent folks. So it's a lot of, very tangible assistance and what would be helpful. I, had a client who was about to go to like before a big meeting with her boss and coworkers, and there was kind of some strife, some like issue among the team. And she just felt like they couldn't hear her, they weren't listening. They've been in these conversations before, but she struggles with getting her point across in the way that other people can receive it. And so we did that whole therapy was like, okay, tell me like you would if you had zero filter and you could be as rude and as mean or whatever. And like essentially we needed to get like all of her emotions out of the things that had hurt her in the past and things she was still processing. So we kind of got that all out there. And then I'm like, okay, what do you need from this meeting? And like I took notes while she was writing, and then I typed it up for her, and she was prepared going into that session because she had kind of felt the emotions she needed to feel. And we still kept them in there, but they weren't as hot, and she was able to articulate, like to your point, and be more clear about what she was needing. A lot of times in grief work, my students always reference they're so terrified they're going to say the wrong thing and make it worse. I think we feel this way in trauma too. And I'm like, the best thing though about this job and this role is you actually don't have to know what to say.
Yeah.
And every time I'm kind of stuck and I'm kind of like, I don't know what to do next, I'm just silent. And it allows the client to kind of sink into like a lower level of emotion that otherwise we're just oh my, being in tech. And oh, once I mess up a word, it's over.
Intellectualize it?
In your brain.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There
intellectualizing. Ooh, there we go.
you go.
So that idea of getting to the emotional depth of it,
Yeah.
and really holding that space. And in grief work, I mean, my clients don't like me. I'm a very direct client. They know who they're getting. I'm very straightforward. I don't hold hands. I will ask if they want to be validated or challenged. I'll end up doing both. But I often am like, nope, you're trying to talk through crying. We're not going to do that. We're going to pause and you're going to just sit in it and you're going to cry in my office and you're not going to like it and you're going to cuss me out by the end of it. And that's going to be fine. I can hold that. And so I spend so much more session time, I would say, pausing people from talking over feeling and letting them feel it to help model what I want it to look like when they're outside my space. And they have the time. I mean, sometimes we can't. We're at work and, a wave is coming, but we have to put it to the side and keep going. That's absolutely appropriate. It's when we have the space and the time and we're with the supportive third people who would hold that for us and we don't do it there that we get into trouble.
Yeah, I love that. I think that that's a lot of the work that I end up doing with some of our clinicians, especially our new clinicians at ITTC. We have a lot of we have a really robust student internship program, so we constantly have students cycling in and out. And I think one of the most important lessons with working with trauma, including grief and everything that goes along with that, is that slowing down process. And that feeling for a clinician of not knowing what to say in that moment is really uncomfortable when you first start.
Oh, yeah.
And then you embrace it and you learn that
Mm.
actually it gives you a ton of information about what the client's thinking, about how you feel as an extra party hearing that information and allowing yourself the room and the client the room to just like have that be what the moment is that you
Yeah.
don't know. Nobody knows. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's okay.
Yeah. And I think to your point, it is something we hopefully develop better skill over time. I can't say I was always really great at it in my early years because I definitely had that like they're they're staring at me. I gotta say
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
And like the longer I've been in it, I'm like, I can outweigh anyone in silence.
Yeah.
Like, you're gonna talk first.
Yeah. Yeah.
I might make a joke so you find some break and have some levity, but I'm gonna put you right back in the same spot. So you can.
Yeah.
But I think, what often surprises clients is, I'm trained in EMDR, so I do a lot of trauma work. And depending on the timing of all of that, right? My brain functions in the Venn circles of grief and trauma, and that every client has both. And like it's going to take me a few sessions to see which one's in front and which one we need to tackle first. If it's a recent trauma, or we're still in that body response as if it's a recent trauma, we got to do the trauma work first. We can't access grief work for quite a long time. And so that's something that, people aren't always familiar with. I'm sure you are, but that idea of like, if the body is reacting as if that is now, we need to handle that piece first before we get into like the feels about it. We have to get out of that hypervigilance. If it's a trauma in the past, then we have, is it the grief of it? Is it the trauma of it? And I end up doing kind of both, I think, for most clients is, sometimes when we get through the EMDR work, I know exactly what's still there for grief work. And then sometimes in the grief work, I'm like, oh, it's this negative belief you're still holding on to. Okay, cool. Let's tackle that with EMDR.
Yeah. Yeah. When did you start to introduce EMDR into your clinical practice?
Yeah, about, I would say 3 or 4 years ago, we were in person. So it would have had to been 3. This is how I'm like measuring time by like, was I in person or on the
Yeah.
computer? So about 3 years ago. And it really felt like the tool that was missing for a while. I don't use it with every client, but man, is it useful for the clients I use it for. And, I have a lot of clients who are like, well, I like trauma, I don't know, right? They have this kind of reaction to the word trauma. Like, I don't know if mine is bad enough, like big T enough. And I'm like, well, I mean, we're targeting negative cognitions. So it doesn't really matter what put you there. You have this belief that, like, let's say you're not good enough.
Yeah.
So, some of it is like normalizing and validating that not everybody has such degrees of trauma. And yet, when you start talking to people, there's little T's, there's big T's. Trauma kind of exists because, again, it's around too much too fast. And that expectation, it didn't look the way I thought or wanted or needed.
Yeah. I hear a lot of those quantifier, I guess you could say, statements. Somebody
Mm-hmm.
else has it worse. Mine
Yeah.
wasn't as bad. It was so long ago. Why does it even matter?
Ancient history. I had a client tell me that she didn't have any trauma because it was such ancient history. And
Yeah.
man, have I proved her wrong. It's been
Yeah.
quite fun.
I mean, there's even a whole phrase around history repeating itself.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. This is how this shows up in your everyday life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know that, and I think and this is maybe part of branching off of sort of what we're talking about, but I think one of the challenges I know in my work with trauma and subsequently the work around grief, although not as specialized for you, is there's a protectiveness around like changing the way that you're thinking about it, because even if the way that you feel about it is terrible, it's like familiar in that moment, and
Oh,
it's
yeah.
okay. It's not really okay, but it's somehow okay. Um,
Knowing. Yeah.
yeah, the knowing, but the challenging of that feels dangerous to
Oh,
people.
sure, sure. The client was like, wait, so your goals are that I don't have any walls and
Yeah.
I'm just out here? I was like, no, your body would shut down and we would not be able to do anything. So I actually brought in a picture. I traveled to Europe in my early 20s, and there's this wall in Switzerland, are made out of stones that are positioned for thousands of years to withstand all the weather because there's holes in the walls so that air and wind can move through them. And so I kept using this as an analogy. And finally, I was like, I got to bring this picture in. And I was like, this is what we want. We don't want the walls to come down, but we want there to be room within them. Like they're protective, they served a purpose, like defense mechanisms, self protection, all of these parts, like whatever, your area of therapy is, all of those served us well for a time until they're no longer serving you and now you want to do something different. And so that like creating movement and room, that's what we're after. Duration, severity, frequency. That's how we make changes.
Duration, severity, frequency. Oh, I wish my staff could hear you say that right now. I say that all the time.
I know it's the real measure. Like, did the wave come less frequent? Was it less intense? And did you
Yeah.
handle it better? Yeah,
How long did it last? Yeah, all of that
yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
One of the other things that you mentioned on I think it might be on your page, your personal page, personal professional page, I guess I should say, is you wrote, "We are not the expert in the story," and you're referencing the clinician. Can you speak to a little bit more of that? I guess the reason that that kind of came up for me now too is in this context of just we were talking about a few minutes ago around sort of expectations on the clinician when
Yeah.
something like grief or depression and anxiety that are associated with
Sure.
chronic illness or anything.
Yeah. And I think, that's what, I'm teaching both BSW level students and MSW level students. So it's like right in the beginning of the program and right when they're graduating. And it's just fascinating because they're still, even, right before graduation, it's that like, oh man, I'm not a student anymore. I'm going to be like a professional. I'm not going to have summers. I'm going to have to like do this differently. And I remember the night before we graduated, my husband and I were like, oh, we don't have jobs. Like, we have these letters soon, but like, what are we doing with this degree? Does anyone really know what they're doing? And it is so helpful for peer consultation, continued supervision, however that looks. I'm married to one, all my friends are therapists, so I kind of do this on the regular. I don't have lots of conversations that don't look just like this. They're not recorded, but this is how my like daily life looks. So I think for me, the idea of expert gets really tricky because in the academic world, right, we use evidence-based practice. Well, based off whom? And based off what research? Well, who are the research participants? Who was the theorist? Like we're still teaching Erickson, for example, or, good old Freud, white men using stuff on other white men. And we're missing so many lenses and so many perspectives that it's very difficult to say, I'm an expert, right? We use the term cultural competency for a very, very long time. And our field has gone away from that, which is great. But I think, even that idea that I, as a, able-bodied, mid-class, white, cis bi woman would be able to articulate for someone else what their experience must have looked like in Rwanda or anywhere else, Palestine right now, anywhere else for that matter, is just so ludicrous. Now, do I have some skills and clinical background and intuition and history in this field that might make it helpful to work with these kind of clients? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think there's so much to bridge and so much to own in our privileges, our positions of power. So if I'm coming in as like, I'm the expert and I know everything to tell you, I have missed such rich history and cultural influences right from the beginning.
Yeah. And I so appreciate you touching on that and recognizing it's in the nuances and even going all the way back to kind of where our research is coming from, who
Yeah,
the fathers of psychology, so to speak,
sure.
are, and who they're measuring things against, and where the current status of research and funding is standing as
Sure.
well. It's a huge issue. We could have probably an entire
Yeah, this is the whole other talk.
whole thing, bring it back in because I could go off on that as well. That term for me is a bristly one, expert. I kind
Yeah.
of because it's wrapped up in all the expectation around societal expectations and how clinicians are portrayed and all of that stuff. And for me, I think it also gives the impression that whatever it is that we're working on with somebody has this linear growth to it.
Yeah.
And that's where the nuances come in that like, okay, sure, in this very big, broad picture, we think this is what grief can look like. And
Yeah.
here are some of the phases of it. And
Mhm.
also the reality of the situation is that people's life experiences, status, orientation, all of these other things play into what that experience actually looks and feels like.
Sure. My little teacher brain was like so happy that you said and there and not but, because I teach that. And so
Yeah,
yell at all my clients.
yeah.
So,
It's
love
the
it's
situation.
an and.
Yeah.
We have to think broader than ourselves. And if we live in two similar of worlds and our clients reflect all of our identities and our families reflect our identities and our neighborhoods, we miss so much richness. And it really, depending on where you live and depending on the way you were raised, it might take additional effort to diversify your little world. Some people's worlds are already naturally that way. My hometown, there wasn't any racial diversity. It's a little better now, but not much. Kansas City, you got to look for it, depending on where you live. I think our world is becoming more diverse, which gets into a different dialogue around scarcity mindset and fear of losing power. But I think, if we could really lean into the beauty that comes from that, the like learning something new, someone who has a different viewpoint and can tell you that, I think we still get in that perfectionist mindset of like, I'm afraid I'm going to be wrong, right? Can I work with a trans client if I don't have that experience, right? And I'm like, well, maybe, but you need to be transparent about lack of experience. You need to be able to own when you mess up, like it's possible. And in clinical supervision, I have this conversation with my folks of, yes, you can work with clients who are different than you and have experiences that you don't. And we have to be intentional about the way we go about that, though, and how repair when you do mess up, and not when, or not if, but when you mess up, because so we got to get past the fear that oh my God, I might. No, you will. Trust me. I put my foot in my mouth 1,000 times. Like, no, that's totally a thing. Now, what do you do next? I care mostly what you do next.
Yeah. I apologized this morning for something. So,
So, that's just how it goes.
it's just how it goes, but I think that that language is really important. It's not the if, it's the absolutely when that's going to happen and at which point and how, because it's going to
And then
happen.
what do you do next?
Yeah, and then where do you go next with that and what's needed in that situation and what kind of ownership do you need to attach some language to and things like that.
Sure. And I think, I reference my partner as my harsh mirror. He's got no problem calling me out and he's like, this is your whiteness. And I'm like, okay, yeah, let me just sit in that for a second, because it's so easy to act out of like, well, what I meant was, nope, doesn't matter. Okay. Well, nope, okay, doesn't matter. So, like, let me sit in that uncomfortability of like, I did something that wasn't great right now and I didn't see it, which makes me fall into like another layer of shame that I didn't see that I did something that wasn't great. And then let me just like process through those feels and then let me hear you when I can hear you. Because if I'm just operating from that part of like that cringe in my body, then I've like missed the point.
Yeah.
And I think that happens so much in our lives, whether it's across race lines or whether it's just in general with people, is that we don't really know where everyone's coming from. We jump to assumptions so often and we're operating from our own story instead of really sitting with theirs.
Yeah. And because people dislike discomfort so much that we're just going to move through it.
Yeah. And I think if anything, that's what grief work has taught me, is given me the ability to sit in someone's really big emotions and know I can't fix it, change it, or move it,
Yeah.
but I can sit there. And not everybody can do that.
Yeah, and not everybody can do that. Yeah. This wasn't necessarily one of my questions, but I'm very curious about your answer, Clara. The podcast is called Unspoken.
Mhm.
And in the original first episode, Athena and I went through and sort of shared like what unspoken means to us in terms of mental health in this context. Is there anything that pops up for you around that name and what that means to you?
We can't process what we don't name. So I think for me, grief work is about all the unspoken stuff that we haven't processed through the feelings to understand the what. And so we don't know what to do. And it kind of is just this continuous cycle. So, like, helping people name it right? I was working with a client this morning with chronic illness, and the thing she's grieving is her loss of functionality, is being able to just like pick her kid up, right? She's got a strained trap, right? And she can still parent in the ways she needs to parent, and she can still show up, in most ways, but she is grieving that loss of functionality. So once we can name it, it's no longer unspoken. It's no longer this heavy thing she's carrying that she doesn't know quite what it is.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Next question. I'm not really sure how to ask, so I'm just
Go
gonna
ahead,
like
do it.
give it a shot.
Yeah.
We talked about how, like, for you and I both, the grief part around working with trauma was not really something that was a part of our like original formal education. It really had to come through seeking out and experiences and things like that. You have this other added sort of, again, this is going to be a little flustery, but just hang in with me. You have this added component of working with people who are also, some people, of course, working within our medical system at the same
Mhm.
time, in
Mhm.
real serious and very important kinds of ways.
Mhm.
You know that, again, different conversation, but our medical system has some major flaws to it in all sorts of different areas. So I guess I'm wondering for you, having been in this field for so long and having had this particular area of interest for so long, are you noticing any changes in like the education of healthcare professionals outside of clinicians? And then also not just in terms of like understanding grief, but also in that inclusivity sort of aspect as well. Are they also being taught and learning how to communicate differently with different groups of people who are going through sort of very outwardly similar experiences?
Sure. Okay. We don't have enough time, but we're going to try. So I think I can only speak to the medical systems I'm around. So one A and one, I don't know. First point. So for me, I have had the privilege of talking and part of a rotation for first year medical students was kind of meeting with me in our area. And so I just ask, you're in the first year of med school, like, what are you learning about communication and like delivering news to a client and or patient? What does that look like? And they'd be like, oh, not much. Or, in organic chemistry and biology and like what the mitochondria does, which is the only part of the cell I can still remember. And yeah. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but that mitochondria lives in a human
Yeah.
and to talk to that human about what it's doing. And so there was a lot of gap in that information. And then what I noticed over the years is they're like, yeah, we learn that later. We get there later. And I'm like, okay. And it did become part of earlier curriculum. It was coming into the med school programs earlier and the nursing programs earlier. So I do think particularly delivering bad news is still kind of a tricky thing, right? Most providers get in for curative work.
Yeah.
They intend to cure. They intend to not have these difficult conversations. I mean, obviously, hospice and palliative docs have different training. But it's amazing to me how many oncologists do not feel prepared to have that dialogue around depression and anxiety, around how it shows up for cancer patients. I think, 10 years ago, there was a stat that only 3% felt comfortable having that dialogue. And
Wow.
that was a national study. And I'm like, that's terrifying because a lot of you are having this conversation. And I'm like, I work with enough clients to know you're not doing it well. So there's some of that. So I think the education has come a long way. Like DEI is now a part of social work education. So is trauma. So is grief. We're doing better in terms of like the cultural pieces around the med school and med education. I know it's getting somewhat better, but at no point do I think we have gotten where we need to get. And I think, my husband is also a children's author and he'll tour schools talking about mental health and diversity and kind of all of that. And like the social and emotional learning in our schools has gotten so much better. And like kids know what a therapist is, and a lot of them know what depression and anxiety mean. We still haven't taught them what grief is. We're still just avoidant of, hey, this is what grief 101 looks like. This is what it looks like in your families, in your homes, in your personal life. But these kids change teachers, they change schools. These kids have grief all over the place for like just very typical childhood stuff. And then you add in all of our like ACEs and our histories and all that stuff. They've been grieving forever. And so we still just have not gone all the way in our culture to be ready to have these conversations.
Gosh, sorry, I'm sort of left wondering what's it going to take to get there. But I guess that's the big question on everybody's brain.
Yeah. And, when I do continuing ed around all of this work, and, cancer, death, diversity, equity, inclusion, there's always the piece on communication and what do you say? And how do you say it? And how do you repair, right? Because all of those are a piece of it. And so I think in our own little spheres of influence, when people are like, well, I'm not a therapist, I don't know how to do that. And I'm like, sure, but you do talk to people. You have people in your lives that you're engaged with, right? Even if you're like, I don't really like people. Yeah, you're still peopling all the time. So how do we get to that part where we can just lean into the vulnerability? There's no lack of like experts, we just talked about that, but the people pioneering this work, right, the people who are really getting into the weeds of how to do it well. And I always argue, like, go learn from somebody who doesn't look like you'll learn more.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well said. Well said. Um, I had an opportunity ahead of this to look at your slide deck for the ITTC Kalos, or rather Kalos training. Can you share with us just sort of on your end what this training is and what it's about?
There's kind of two cancer specific ones around diagnosing depression and anxiety in cancer patients, as well as supporting the whole family through the cancer experience. There's so much information and so many ways we could go with that. But I thought, tailoring it through the family system would be really helpful for the people who do have to work with everybody, regardless of their age, when you're in agency work and you don't get to choose, kind of supporting the whole patient, even if you're just dealing with, maybe an adult, but like how to work with their teens, as well as their older adults that are in their lives. It kind of goes through the whole gamut. The depression and anxiety, I think, is so important to recognize when we've reached that clinical level of something else, when a lot of cancer related side effects, a lot of the physical side effects from cancer look so much like fatigue, like withdrawing, like anxious thoughts, right? That there's a normative kind of level. I don't love that word, but there's a level we would expect. And then there's the level where we get kind of into that clinical distress and when we need to maybe putting in some other parameters to help these patients and their family members so that we can kind of get them to where they're thriving the best they can in that situation.
Ah, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. My other question is a bit more personal in nature. I know that you, obviously, we've been talking a lot about the different people that you're working with and the kind of work that you're doing. And we also know as clinicians that boundaries and self-care and burnout and compassion fatigue and all of those things are legitimate. What types of things do you do to keep yourself feeling like you've got the bandwidth and the resources to be able to offer the kind of support that you're offering?
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it's Nikita Valerio's quote of we do a disservice shouting self-care at people who really need community care. And I believe in community care. I believe in asking for help when I need it. I have lots of friends who are like, I don't know how you do all the things that you do. And I'm like, sure. And you do 1,000 things I don't want to do all the time. So, asking for help, not feeling like I'm burdening anybody, right? I've got well past that. But I think for me, it's the mindfulness of I'm doing this thing and this is what I'm working on now. And I'm staying in my body and I'm staying present. I drink hot water all day. It's a thing that really grounds me. I get a brand new cup before every session. So it's a little burning my hands and feels good in my body. And people think I'm weird because I don't put anything in it. I just really find little ways that feel like levity and reprieve and pay attention to them. You know, I do a daily gratitude with my sister. We've been doing it for about 4 years now on a shared note so we can see each other's. And it's just super fun. It's like the smallest things that you know, it's not like, oh, the love of my family. You know, it's the fact that my refrigerator now fits better in our house after we sawed a little bit of our counter because it didn't quite fit at first, right? Like that's amazing. And I'm very excited about it. So I am just like finding those little fun things and recognizing we can't do everything all day, every day, right? I can be a really great therapist some days and maybe a little bit less of a great, you know, teacher. And then I have to really be a teacher one day. And then maybe I'm like sometimes overtaxed. And I'm like, kids, can we watch a movie and just get pizza? Like, you don't really care about a meal. You're down with that, right? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, I have one parenting. But what you don't know is I'm just too tired to do anything else. So I think it's that. It's like giving ourselves the allowance to do less.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I have a mantra that I tell myself and it's step with intention. And
Mhm.
I've had it for years. It just helps keep me focused. But one of the areas that I've applied that to is things like this. It's attaching intention to things that maybe I'm already doing that are really would seem otherwise just part of my day or just part of the things to get through. But like feeling the hot cup of coffee, I have to be intentional about what purpose that's serving for me. And it's relaxing and it's grounding. Coincidentally, and this probably won't make it onto the podcast, which is just fine with me. I'm also somebody who drinks hot water throughout the day. Yeah, and it started with me. I had a supervisor who told me I needed to work on silence. This is very early on, right? Like
Yeah.
sitting with silence, and had recommended that I have a hot
Mhm.
mug in my hands. I couldn't drink, I couldn't drink coffee for eight
Yeah,
hours.
I know.
So I had to transition to water. I put lemon in it now, but you're absolutely right. What you said just resonated. Like there is something very intentional and soothing, and like that can be very grounding. And I think that those things often go overlooked or just not like attached to the meaning of it or the
Yeah.
intentionality
No, I love that. And yeah, I did it really early on. Most of my joy of coffee is the hot mug.
of
I do
it.
need caffeine, but yeah, after a couple, I'm like, I can't do this anymore. And the hot water really just subbed right in. It's how I stopped drinking soda, is I just didn't need it. The hot water did such a great job.
The only other thing, and maybe you can just speak for a little bit on this, that I just really appreciate and is something that I use in my own practice, and I talk with my clinicians about including as well for whatever is natural for them. But you talked about, you wrote on your website, humor, sarcasm, and cussing are welcome. And I just kind of wanted to touch on that and ask you, like, was that always something you felt comfortable with, or were you encouraged to bring that component of your personality into the space?
Okay, so I was raised in a home where cussing was welcomed. My father cussed in almost every sentence. My mother, not so much. And there were definitely some words that would cross the line with her. So we kind of knew what we could and what we couldn't get away with. But we were also very educated on like, these are home words. These are not go to school, say around at your friend's house, like don't mess around. And we have raised our kids the same. Although the like school, my 6 year old is still like, I picked him up today and he's like, oh shit. And I'm like, shh. Shh. So for me, cussing has really always been my way of honoring my dad. It's like just kind of, it's natural to me. I do not ever cuss in anger. So it is only in storytelling. It's only in, you know, just the joy of it. And actually, I think the podcast you listened to might have been for NPR. And my my husband listened to it and he got to the end and he was like, I mean, you sound smart, but you always sound smart. You sounded good. You always sound good. He's like, something was weird though. And I was like, what? And he just sat with it. He's like, I can't place it. I can't place it. But there's something off. And then all of a sudden he starts laughing and he's like, you made it 30 minutes without cussing. And I was like, I did. I worked so hard. And he's like, I could hear the pauses when you were speaking that I knew your brain was editing and trying. And he's like, because you don't pause. And my cadence is so fast that people complain about how fast I talk that I really have to be like, I can't slow down. It's not my natural, you know, it's both nerves and excitement, but it's just my cadence. And so I would pause in that talk and he was like, yeah, you were trying not to cuss, weren't you? And I was like, it was so hard. I tried to make it 30 minutes. And I honestly just own, I can't tell you, Catherine, how many clients quote that line from my profile and they're like, this is why I called you. I can be
I,
my,
I
and I'm
believe.
perfect.
I believe it. I
And
believe.
I just, I own the privileges I have of being white, and having the power and positions that I have of working for myself. But I I'm as authentic. This is exactly who I am in the therapy space, in the classroom, in my home. I don't have to change myself in any sort of setting, but I've worked very hard to build that life. And it definitely comes from a very privileged place. My partner would not say the same about his.
Yeah. Well, I first off, I think that's hilarious that a lot of your people quote that exact
Oh,
line. I guess it makes sense as I pulled it out and put it in quotes myself. But I just thought that was also like a really lovely way of noting that there can be humor and there can be extra words to get your point across, and there can be sarcasm, and that there can be work done within that space, and that actually it fosters work in ways that maintaining I don't know what the right way to say this is, but like a sense of seriousness or distance from that humor doesn't offer.
Yeah, and I mean, I was described as irreverent once, and I thought that was actually probably the perfect phrase for me. I don't dismiss seriousness, and I sit in what is heavy and what is real, and I bring levity because it's necessary to create some breathing room. And I think, I do joke, like if my client, I'm like, if you leave every time and you're like, oh, that just feels so good. I was heard and I was validated. I haven't done my job. Like you need to leave and not like me sometimes. You need to leave and be like, oh, I don't like it. This doesn't feel good. And in fact, I have a judge that I work with that is one of my favorite clients because it's just so easy to just that intellectual part. I mean, I'm just like, nope, stop, you gotta cry now. And I'm like, fuck you. I mean, they are cussing all throughout the session, and it's really the best as far as I'm concerned. I don't even have to think about, how to filter or anything like that. I get to be as authentically me as possible. But I think, I do tell people that right up front because I gave up professionalism a long, long time ago, and this is what you get. And I always, that's my reviews in class and in writing, like, I just like the way you're real. And I'm like, yeah, because what else are we doing? I ain't got time for that.
Yeah, especially within the context of the space that you're working in.
Yeah, no, these clients do not need me to be in a suit
No.
pretending to be an expert. I wear hoodies
Yeah.
and sometimes pants that
Yeah.
have most of the time they're linen or sweatpants.
Yeah. And that hoodie might say shit across the front
Yeah,
of
yeah, generally doesn't cuss on my clothing, but definitely out of my mouth all the time.
it. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. I'm glad I squeezed in that last one. That touched me, and humor and authenticity in that sort of space is always when I'm interested in pushing for our clinicians, especially our younger clinicians who have this very
Yeah.
formal sense of what it looks like to be a therapist. And that's not,
I know it's worse than dating, like trying to find a therapist online. When I was looking, I was like, I hate all of your bios.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like those wellness words do not land with
Yeah.
me. I
Yeah.
just can't. And so I was really struggling with how to write it and finally just without thought just wrote it and I was like, I'm done. This is it.
I love it. It works for you.
It does. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Clara. That really is all the questions that I have for you today. But hopefully I'll get to bump into you. I love that you're doing so many trainings for us. We're so happy to have all of these things up on our website and getting this launched. And it's just
Yeah.
such an opportunity to be able to offer another lens, another voice to somebody who's doing work that they feel so passionate about.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Great.